Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Tom Eckman here with lesson 12 of learning Greek by reading the Greek New Testament. Today we're going to be looking at the Gospel of John again, and we are in chapter 1. Today we're going to look at verse 23. Again, a single verse, just like last time around, and for the same reason. We're actually going to be seeing a lot of new vocabulary words. So let's take a look first of all at the verse and just read through it, and forgive me if I'm not reading it the way you are used to hearing this, Koine Greek read, but I'll give it my best shot here. Ephe ego phone bauntas ente ἐρήμῳ Eւθύνατε ten hadon kuriu καθώς εἶπεν Ἐσαΐας ho prophetes. Some of those words, hopefully you've identified and you're thinking you have it pretty well under control. But that's as soon as we look at what we're going to see that's new, we recognize there are a lot of words here. So hopefully for some of you, you already recognize them and you're well on your way to understanding the entire verse. But let's walk through and just see what we can look at in terms of these new words. Old words, ego, of course, I, we hear that as ego, and we're familiar with that. N is in, that's not difficult. And tain, and ho, we should recognize as definite articles. So that should be easy. And then prophetes, of course, is prophet. So that's not difficult either. I'm sure a couple other words like Ėsαΐas you can recognize. So, but we'll go on. Let's take a look at some of these new words. Βοῶντος, which you might look at and think, oh, that sure does look like a noun with omicron sigma. Could be two different kinds of endings if it were a noun, but this is actually a participle. So it's crying. Eўpεν, stem change from lego. Lego in the present tense is I say or I tell. And here we've got the aorist stem, so it's he, she, or he or she. In this case, we'll probably run with he or she. In this context, he said. So ἐρήμῳ from ἐρήμος, which is desert or wilderness. Eւθύνατε, which is make straight or straighten. And you probably recognize as you're looking at this, that tau epsilon at the end, which should almost always without fail tell you that you're looking at a second person plural. So ephe, an unusual verb, which we'll talk more about. It's actually an imperfect. So he was saying, in this context, could be she was saying, but he was saying. And then we have this, again, this proper name for Isaiah, and it's Ėsαΐas. So we have this mark on top that you may be familiar with, circumflex and acute and a grave accent, but this is his own animal. This is actually what's called diaresis. And again, that's another word that you can pronounce several different ways. So I'll leave that up to you, but again, coming from Greek, it's called a diaresis. And the idea here is to pull the vowels apart. And you may be familiar with this or something similar if you know the traditional spelling of the word naive, where you have those two dots over the I, and that noun coming, or that adjective coming from French. But the purpose is the same, to separate the A from the I so that you don't have a diphthong. So instead of naive, or knave, some people would say, you actually have naive. Here we have the very same kind of thing, only it involves, sorry about that. It involves, three vowels. We have an alpha, an iota, and an alpha, and it's pulling them all apart. So you have Ėsαΐas for Isaiah. Next, we have καθώς. Καθώς is just as or just like. And I'm, typically when I'm teaching Greek students, I'm telling them when you run across this, it is a stronger way to compare or draw a comparison. So I like to say it's just like or just as. And I think you'll find yourself comfortable more and more comfortable translating it that way as you run across it in the New Testament. This is very often drawing a very, very direct comparison. All right, Lord, kuriu, you may recognize that omicron upsilon as a genitive, and you'd be right. You probably know kurios, so I'm, should not be a difficult reach to see kuriu as Lord here. Now, we'll talk about the reason this is not capitalized or small capped, or I should say small capped, whereas often it is in the Old and New Testament, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Jourdan, strange noun, because you see that you have this new ending, which should tell you it's an accusative, but omicron nu, you're thinking masculine, and guess what? This is a different animal. So we'll talk about that as well. Similar kind of thing that we're going to run across with ἐρήμῳ. Finally, phonė, which is voice. It's a feminine noun, of course, and this can be translated as voice, noise. Think of a couple other things like that, but it's usually translated either voice or noise, depending on or sound. Sound is the other word I was looking for, contingent upon the context. So that being said, let's take a look at basic translation, and then we'll walk through the words that are within the verse. He was saying, I am a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, just like he said, Isaiah the prophet. And of course, we're going to take this as the subject, of course. So, but we'll come back to that. All right, first couple of words that you see that are new is fa. Fa is one that would be maybe difficult to identify because it's one of those me verbs, and me verbs are really kind of their own animal. As you go through a study of verbs in Greek, you might say, well, I don't know, I don't know all the forms and how to break that down. A couple of things you might want to see. If you know it's from femi, you should know that it's missing something on the end. And one of the places that that's often true is in the third person singular, which is what we have here. You also notice that if it's from femi, then that epsilon must be an epsilon augment, which tells you that it's some kind of, it's either going to be aorist or imperfect. In this case, it's going to be an imperfect, and the reason is because it's from femi, so there's no stem change. So what you have here is this imperfect form of femi with an epsilon as the augment to tell you that it's imperfect. So he was saying, I am a voice, and this voice should be pretty easy. The idea here, though, that you want to catch is that it's a predicate nominative. Now, we know ego, John the Baptist using a pronoun referring to himself. This doesn't in itself have a gender, but we know John's talking about himself, which would be masculine. This, however, phonė, is a feminine noun, and so as a noun, you can't decline it, can't put a masculine inflection on it. So while it does agree in the sense that it's a nominative and that it's singular, which is what we would expect if it's in agreement, you're missing the verb I am, of course, but that's very, very common in Greek. But again, as a predicate nominative, while this agrees in person and number, it does not in gender because phonė is feminine. All right, so on to the next piece, βοῶντος. Βοῶντος. Again, you might look at this and say, all right, it's predicate nominative, so or so it's part of this, could be part of the clause, might be a nominative singular masculine, which then would make it agree with ego, but in all of those things you would be off. And here's why. The noun here would have been boē, so it wouldn't look anything like this. But if you know that the verb is boāo, Then you say, okay, βοῶντος, right? It's probably tied to the verb, which means that this new tau is clearly what's called a participle morpheme that tells you you're looking at a present participle. The as, therefore, since it would be declined in a as a third declension participle, that as tells you that you're actually looking at a genitive singular. So this here is to line up with this entire phrase and the idea, and especially with phonė, I am a voice of crying. Now that doesn't ring true for us. We wouldn't say it like that, a voice of crying, but it's very, very common in Greek. And the idea here is that it's simply describing the way that the voice is speaking. It's a voice of crying. It's the kind of crying kind of voice, or it's a crying voice, crying out. And the idea here is could be cry, shout, scream. Boao has that kind of range, but obviously in this context, you're talking about John the Baptist proclaiming loudly his message, and that message is in the wilderness or desert. That's our next word, and that is actually, depending on how many cases you've been taught in Greek, it could either be, if it's part of the four main case system, you'd call it a dative. And I know that Bill Mounts and others go with that sort of simplified system. Historically, there are a lot of arguments been made for a 7-case system if you don't include the vocative. And in that system, this would be a locative because it's really geared towards speaking about a location. Where was he? He was in the wilderness or in the desert. So independent of that, it's a singular. You would think, looking at the end, and especially if you know that it comes from ἐρήμῳ, you might think that it's masculine, but you'd be wrong. And here's how you know. Here's your cheat. Take a look at the definite article in ente ἐρήμῳ. That would not be able to be, that would be a to instead of a te. You wouldn't have an eta here. That eta tells you that this noun is actually feminine, even though it's declined, even though the inflections are masculine inflections. We look at them and we see a masculine inflection. This is actually a feminine noun. And the way you know that, as sort of a cheat, is to look at the definite article. That will help you out. All right, next, Eւθύνατε. This is a tough one. This one was tough for me because I knew it came from euthuno. And I started scratching my head and said, okay, there's something unusual about this. And of course, in the context, if you're saying, okay, I know what it means, I know that it means prepare. Well, in the context, he's a voice crying. What is he crying? He's crying prepare. Well, if you say it that way, you should be thinking imperative. Well, it just so turns out that an aorist imperative, and again, in a second person singular, this aorist imperative is going to look just like a present active indicative. So that's what you have here. You have a second person plural aorist active imperative. And again, part of that equation should simply be saying, okay, it's what I would expect here. And I might not know how all those are formulated, but given the context, it does make very good sense. All right. Next, we have ὦδον, and it is from ὦδος. So you're hearing ὦδος and ὦδον. You see the new, you say that's got to be accusative, got to be singular. That makes very good sense. Matches the definite article as far as that new to tell you that it's accusative singular. However, this is another one, very much like ἐρήμῳ, that this way, the word for way, or ὦδος, way, road, path, is a feminine noun. Again, declined like a masculine, but it is actually feminine. And again, thankfully, you have your cheat. You take a look at the definite article, you see that it's got that eta in it. You say that's feminine. That's clearly feminine. So that should inform you that while that is inflected like a masculine noun, it is actually feminine. And unfortunately, there are more than a few of those things. If you've studied other languages, you know that that occurs in Portuguese and Spanish, and many other languages, I'm sure, have similar situation where you have those kinds of a feminine noun that's declined like a masculine, or a masculine noun that's declined like a prophetes, like it looks like it's feminine, but it's clearly a masculine. So, but that definite article there is there to help you. All right, next is kuriu, and you'll notice that I said of the Lord. I did the small caps thing, and we'll talk about that later. But the idea is we know where this comes from. So that being said, you can see the omicron upsilon tells you that it is genitive singular. If you know it's from kurios, there we go. It's from kurios. So we would expect, knowing that it means Lord, we would expect it to be a masculine noun, and that it is. You don't have any kind of a definite article, but clearly a masculine noun in this particular case. And followed by kathos. Kathos, like I said earlier, just as or just like. And it says, this is the Semantic Domains Lexicon, Locative. They say it serves as a marker of similarity. And I would say just that. As you're reading through your New Testament, you have a number of conjunctions that will serve to tell you that there's some kind of a comparison going on. But this is one of the stronger ones, I would say. And more often than not, it's trying to draw an exact analogy, draw an exact comparison. Okay. Last couple of words. Number one is ἐῆπεν, one of a handful of verbs that have very irregular stem pattern. Take a look. I mean, we start with Lego. And as you're learning Greek vocabulary, Lego is probably one of the early words you might have learned. And all the different forms of Lego, but then when you change stems, you go to a different tense. Take a look. Let's take a look at the pattern. Lego in the present, that stem goes to arrow in the future. If you've learned your future tense in Greek, you probably are looking for that sigma. You're saying, where's the sigma? Well, guess what? Again, this is an irregular stem change for certain words, and there's only a handful, I'd say less than 20, where you see these kinds of pretty radical stem changes where you go, what does this one have to do with this one? And not being a morphologist, I would say if you're interested in that, go talk to somebody like a Bill Mounts who really is a morphologist. Then we have this third stem, which is apon, which is the aorist stem. So if we know apon is the aorist stem and apon is the first singular, we should be able to look at this epsilon nu. And epsilon nu very, very often tells you that you're looking at a third singular verb. So again, third person singular verb. In this case, it is an aorist because it comes from the aorist stem, and it's actually from Lego. So anyway, in this case, it's simply said, right? And then finally, ဧσαΐας, we have this noun that's proper name, singular, it's masculine, and it has this diaresis thing there in the middle to separate between all those vowels going on. That being said, let's go back, take a look at our smooth translation. We'll be close to finished. He was saying, I am a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, just like Isaiah the prophet said. And again, in this case, all we're doing is we're moving that verb to the end, as is very, very often the case. You've got the words, the parts of the sentence doing like this in Greek, whereas in English, we have a very uniform pattern. So, all right. And finally, this is an important verse on a couple of levels. Number one is that here's John the Baptist, and he knows his purpose. He knows his mission. His mission is to prepare the way for Jesus to come, and he says so later in John. And he knows his mission. And later in Matthew, he's like, was I really doing the right thing? And are you really the one that I've been preparing for? So he's thinking he's preparing for the way for the Messiah. But to prepare the way for the Messiah, which is what we see in so many Old Testament passages, what he says is prepare the way of the Lord. And he equates that with Messiah. And yet the word Lord in its original occurrence, we'll find is actually Yahweh or Jehovah. So very, very strong passage to point to the deity of Christ. So from my perspective, that's one of the two things that I think is very important about this verse, is you have this idea of prepare the way of the Lord, and where it comes from, which is in Isaiah 40. Prepare the way of the Lord. Lord is actually what's called the Tetragrammaton, or the name of God that the Jews would refuse to pronounce. They wouldn't say Yahweh or Jehovah. They would say Hashem or Adonai when they saw those four Hebrew letters together. Well, that's what John the Baptist is doing. He's saying, hey, prepare the way of the Lord. Well, who is that? Well, that would be Jesus. So John the Baptist clearly was looking for Jesus to be that Messiah who was the Lord, or Yahweh, or God. Very strong indicator that John the Baptist understood him as God. So beyond that, what we see is that in Matthew, he gives you a very short quote of this passage, which comes from Isaiah 40. And the reason that's true, Luke 3 has a much longer quote. But the reason that's true here is because he's speaking to this audience, and he's trying to keep it short. He's just trying to give them the basic information as though his audience understood where it came from. So in any case, Luke 3 actually does give more of the quote to fill us in on the context that John would have had in his mind. And what was that context? Let's take a look at Isaiah 40. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path, or make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And there are several Old Testament passages that line out these same ideas, that Messiah would come, his people would need to be prepared for his arrival, and when he arrived, he would wipe out his enemies, set up his kingdom and rule and reign. So we have that, seen here as well. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill brought low. The crooked places shall be made straight, and the rough places smooth. I don't know about you, I haven't seen that yet. So whatever John the Baptist was talking about, he's looking forward to something that he assumed was true based on Old Testament promises, and he was looking forward to the fulfillment of those Old Testament promises in the person of the Messiah. Of course, we can look back and go, well, yeah, he was a Jew. He was speaking to Israelites who were under the Old Covenant, and from their perspective, the church is a mystery. So he's looking forward and seeing the chain of events. And from his perspective, the chain of events would be, Messiah comes and he's wiping out his enemies, and then he's setting up his kingdom and removing all unrighteousness, and then peace and safety. Everything is wonderful, and Messiah reigns on the throne of David. So that's what he has in the back of his mind. So part of that is in verse 4, everything's going to be level. And that is what we see if we look at Revelation 16 at the end of the tribulation. So it's one of the things that he would have been expecting. But beyond that, he said at that time that we would see the glory of the Lord, which would be revealed, and all flesh will see it together. Now, there are any number of people who say, well, this is simply a, spiritual. He means that this is in heaven, you know, this is a heavenly judgment. Like, no, that doesn't work here. This really is a place where you have to say, where is it that Messiah's judgment would be seen by all flesh? Where and when would that happen? I would argue that John the Baptist, looking forward and not seeing the church, would see the Messiah coming in judgment, and in judgment, removing his enemies, flattening out leveling the playing field, and setting up his kingdom, and all flesh seeing his glory. And that's basically what we see if we look at Revelation 19. So all those pieces fit together very, very well if we take John the Baptist's message at face value based on Old Testament prophecy. So again, all flesh will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord, Yahweh, has spoken. So that being said, we'll call it a day, and God bless everyone, and see you next time.